In this animation, you'll conduct an experiment in which you can test whether evolution will occur in a population of fruit flies. You will test these flies for how long they can go without food before they die, a measure called starvation resistance. In biology, the term population has a specific meaning. It is a group of organisms of the same species living in a particular geographic region, in this case, a cage in your laboratory. How do you measure starvation resistance? In this experiment, you start the clock at the time you remove the food, but not water, from the cage. Fruit flies have tiny bodies that don't hold very large caloric reserves. After a relatively short time, they begin to die. Using a graph, you can look at the number of flies compared to how many hours they survived before starvation. From this preliminary study, you observe that the average starvation resistance in this population is 20 hours. This marks your first step in using the scientific method, observation. Now you come up with the hypothesis that fruit flies can indeed be selected to have a greater resistance to starvation. This means that you're testing whether the population can evolve from one generation to the next. Your prediction is that if the population undergoes selection for starvation resistance, subsequent generations of fruit flies can exceed an average 20 hours of starvation resistance. To conduct the experiment, you begin with a large number of flies in the cage. The population is actually much larger than depicted here, with each fly representing 500 individuals. Therefore, the population consists of about 5,000 flies. As before, you begin by removing the food. Note that the flies in this experiment are highly variable in their traits for starvation resistance, and that these variations exist even before our experiment begins. The experiment simply allows us to identify which of these flies have the traits for the strongest starvation resistance. After 80% of the flies have died, you save the remaining 20% by adding food back to the cage. In this way, you've selected only the most starvation-resistant fruit flies. On average, this first generation has a starvation resistance of 20 hours. Will the next generation be able to go longer without food? Recall that these two remaining flies actually represent 1,000 flies from the population, and that this population still retains a lot of variability for starvation resistance. After the surviving flies eat, they'll have the energy to reproduce. The females will eventually lay eggs on the food. Now you collect the eggs and transfer them to a new cage. These eggs represent Generation 2, and they eventually hatch and develop into new adult fruit flies. It's important to emphasize that this new generation consists of offspring from the most starvation-resistant flies of the previous generation. We perform the same procedure with Generation 2. Again, we save the most starvation-resistant flies at the very end by adding back some food. Note that the average starvation resistance of Generation 2 is 23 hours, 3 hours longer than that of Generation 1. Although we've raised these flies under artificial conditions, the populations have undergone what is called natural selection. Note that in our experiment, the flies that are alive are the most starvation resistant, which is a heritable and highly variable trait. Clearly, these flies will have a greater reproductive success than the flies that are now dead. By definition, natural selection is a mechanism of evolution that occurs when there is a heritable variation for a trait, such as starvation resistance, and individuals with one version of the trait have greater reproductive success than do individuals with a different version of that trait. What if you kept repeating these steps for new generations, beginning with eggs only from the fruit flies and the top 20% of starvation resistance in each generation? Would the average starvation resistance increase after 5 generations? In fact, it would. The population's average survival would be about 32 hours. How much can the population evolve in terms of its average starvation resistance? Amazingly, after 60 generations, the average fly can survive more than 160 hours without food. In 60 generations, from an experiment that took nearly 3 years, the flies have gone from a starvation resistance of less than a day to one of nearly a week. At the point when the food is removed, the flies in generation 60 are noticeably fatter than the flies were in the first generation. Their bodies have developed larger caloric reserves. What happened to this population? In a word, evolution. You have been able to breed more starvation-resistant populations. Although we're showing individual flies from the first and last generations, keep in mind that an individual does not evolve in its lifetime. Evolution is, instead, a genetic change in a population. From this experiment, we can now answer the question, does evolution occur? With an unambiguous yes. We can also answer the question, does evolution occur, by looking at how antibacterial soaps kill bacteria. This experiment is similar to the fruit fly experiment, except a different selection pressure is at work. A common antimicrobial agent called triclosan is used in many of these products. The 800,000 to 1 million bacteria on your hands are highly variable. Consider that triclosan can quickly kill some of them. These bacteria are the least resistant of the bunch. That is, they are the least able to survive the chemical treatment and are depicted with a light color. Other bacteria are more resistant and are depicted here in a dark color. The resistance levels of the rest of the bacteria run between these two extremes. When you begin washing your hands with the antimicrobial soap, the first bacteria to die are the ones that are least resistant to triclosan. On average, people spend less than a minute washing their hands. However, triclosan takes several minutes to kill the most resistant bacteria. So after a single minute, notice which bacteria are left to reproduce. Only the most resistant ones. Before triclosan, the population contained bacteria with a wide variation in resistance. But after washing with triclosan, the population contains just the most resistant bacteria. By using this product, you have selected for the most resistant bacteria and thus caused evolution to happen. What can you do about this? The two simplest alternatives are to wash your hands for much longer or use soaps without antibacterial agents.